A warm welcome to our audience in another podcast of the series related to the book Intercultural Competence Through Virtual Exchange, Achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'm Dr. Elena Douvlou, and I'm the moderator for this session. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Architecture at Metropolitan College in Greece. And I'm very excited to be joined today by my co-editor of the book, Professor Elena Tzoumis, and we're going to have a very interesting discussion regarding her chapter in the book with the title, The Importance of Virtual Debates in Intercultural Learning About Sustainability, the case of nuclear spent fuel reprocessing in France versus the United States. Kelly, welcome to this unusual role in the podcast, that of the author of a chapter in the book.
Well, thank you, and thanks for doing this podcast, Elena. So this is a very interesting section on how you can use virtual exchange and how important they are when you're talking about intercultural learning with sustainability, but in the specific case of nuclear spent fuel reprocessing in France versus the US. The role of debates in general has been a very long tool, pedagogical tool over history, primarily used in more the social sciences and law. And my co-author today, who could not join us, is Dr. Cynthia Boyer, and she's with the INU Champlain University of Toulouse in France. And she has been working with me for quite some time. And I actually went out and recruited, I wanted a professor from France. And the reason for this is because the United States and France have very, very different policies on nuclear energy and the disposal of nuclear waste and what they do to take that waste and reprocess the spent fuel. In the United States, I suspect most of our viewers are not aware that former President Jimmy Carter in 1977 outlawed or prohibited reprocessing of nuclear fuels. So to Carter, he was very concerned about nuclear security, and he prohibited this reprocessing in the US. And so that continued for some time, but now has been actually revised. In France, they have always reprocessed their fuel. France, for many, many decades, was 85 to 90% nuclear based in their energy source. That decreased over the last couple of years and now is going back up because of the problems with energy in Europe, particularly from receiving energy from Russia. That has become a problem over the more recent years. And so France, under its current policies, has resumed nuclear energy pursuits. Now, Greece, tell us, Elena, this would be a good time to contrast with Greece.
With another European country that actually is not getting its energy supplies from nuclear power. Nuclear power is not on the agenda. It hasn't been on the agenda, and currently is looking into other sources of renewable energy. So for Greek people, this is actually a very out of context idea, both in terms of nuclear energy policy and as well as nuclear waste policy. So at least to our European audience that, like Greece in their country, they do not depend on nuclear energy, I think this is going to provide a very interesting new context of how to deal with this. So thank you for providing us the context of that. And I suspect that France was a very important collaborator in participating in these debates, because obviously it provides a very different approach, both to nuclear energy policy, but also to nuclear waste policy. Am I correct?
Yes, very much so. And in the United States, to contrast even further, the United States relies on nuclear energy about 19% of its total energy profile. And what's very interesting in the United States is that declined as our nuclear energy plants are aging out. However, recently now, we are looking back towards nuclear energy to add more to our nuclear profile. So we are actually rehabilitating the aged out plants to restart them. And that's what's happening in the US. So if this continues and if they're successful at rehabilitating these older plants that are shut down, that 19% of our energy profile that depends on nuclear should rise. But it's really dependent on if indeed we can get those plants restarted.
And it's interesting, Kelly, that you have actually mentioned also the dynamics of the context and how they change in terms of what is happening in Europe, around Europe, and how the policies change according to the needs and the changes, the geopolitical dynamics in the area.
Yes, and I want to say something more about that because as a public policy expert, there's something taking place right now in nuclear energy that is very interesting. As you know, nuclear energy throughout the world was really not being a growth sector for around the world, actually. And when we started to get more polarization in our international politics, like France's approach, they decided to do more in the nuclear area because it allows them that independence from energy sources outside of their country. But what's happening, which is very interesting, is that recently, because of these international pressures for energy, and as well as there's now a recent buildup of nuclear weapons, because nuclear energy and nuclear weapons are somewhat related. They both require a certain amount of fuel. We have redefined the nuclear energy industrial complex has basically been very successful at redefining and reframing in the international community nuclear energy as a clean energy source, as a renewable energy source. And as a result, unlike the past, many of the opponents of nuclear energy are environmental interest groups, some of our civil rights groups, because much of these the pollution from these energy sources and waste are usually near environmental justice communities. It has become redefined as a green and rebranded as a renewable energy source. And so there has become a resurgence in interest in using nuclear energy as a bigger role in the profile for countries. Now, the history of nuclear energy, particularly in the United States, is very difficult to rely on this energy source. The problem is cost and schedule. So from a project management perspective, we have never in the United States, and we at the highest point had approximately 110 nuclear energy plants operating. It's much less than that now because of the aging plants that are coming on board and being shut down. But we had tremendous overruns. I mean, 100 percentages, 200% overruns in costs and schedule. And that makes nuclear energy one of our most expensive energy sources. And yes, it does not emit perhaps the level of carbon that fossil fuels does. This is why they call it clean. It does generate thousands of years, and in some cases, tens of thousands of years of nuclear waste that has to be managed in a variety of ways. And so we've seen the problems with that, with Fukushima, with 3 Mile Island, that comes to a great cost to the environment and the people surrounding the plant, as well as other countries in the case of Fukushima, because of the ocean disposal. That nuclear energy in the past was not pursued. But as I said, there is definitely a resurgence taking place now across the world in looking at nuclear energy because it allows energy independence. The other thing is, for the United States, much of our uranium was also being purchased from Russia. And so there now is plants being open for uranium mining. One in particular is down by our Grand Canyon National Park that is actively now mining uranium.
That is correct. And thank you for providing this overall context. I remember also, again, I drew some of my own experiences as a new lecturer at the end of the 90s at the University of Sheffield, where we were teaching about renewable energy sources, and we had nuclear energy as a separate entity within a class where we had to discuss the pros and cons, and obviously it was not included in the agenda of renewable energy sources, and how much this the context has changed. The debate about the use of nuclear energy has changed over the last 3 decades. Now, taking one of the last words I mentioned, debates. Debates has been a very interesting pedagogical tool that you have employed as a methodology in your virtual exchange collaboration with Professor Boyer in France. And I'm very eager to learn more about this methodology. How do debates work as a pedagogical tool?
Well, excellent question. Debates have, as I said in the beginning, have been around a very long time, and they are considered active learning. So what happens is we asked students from France and students from the United States to pick a side of being either supportive of reprocessing the spent fuel and using it in our nuclear energy power plants, or to be opposed to that particular process. And we allowed students to pick whichever side, there were only 2 sides that they wanted to be on. And sometimes what was really interesting is we had students crossing their particular country's policies. So for instance, we had students from the United States signing up for being supportive of nuclear reprocessing, which the United States had not done. And then the French students also would pick being opposed to this nuclear reprocessing. And so that was pretty interesting to see how those students actually changed their policy perspective of their country by participating in these group dynamics. But going back to the role of debates, debates are very important, particularly in the legal education. And the partner from France, her students were actually legal studies students pursuing a law degree. And my students were actually a big mixture of undergraduate students that actually took part in this class, and they were primarily freshmen. And so we actually, again, saw that we can transverse the divide in the type of discipline that the student is in and their year in school, and still have a really effective virtual exchange. So the students prepared by picking each side, and they had to go out and do their own research. We gave them some basic foundations. For instance, the 1977 proclamation by President Carter was given to the group. Also, there's a couple of good TED Talks that we gave links to. And we asked the students to go out and get their own sources, which they had to build their arguments around. And then we had a strict schedule that took place for the debate. So we had both openings, we had rebuttals, and then we had closures. So the students were constrained in time, even though it took an hour, but they were constrained in time and very structured in this type of virtual exchange. Again, this wasn't the first time that they met. We did the 2 meetings, of course, and we actually played a couple games. But the research that we conducted were on classes from 19 2021 and 2022. And so we compared the experiences that the students express from these outcomes. Past research shows and says that, there's very positive associations that students have between debate participation and their post-graduation skills. One study in 2017 by Rogers et al. Actually talks about over 2 decades of examining alumni that had participated in debates while they were in school, showed that they actually had higher achievement, and that the debate actually allows for more individual critical thinking, problem-based learning, because they actually had to look at this debate and decide what role reprocessing should play in society. And overall, what the research is finding, there's another really good piece of research on debates by Lee et al. In 2021, is that using debates in a course makes the course more interesting and is an efficient teaching method for cultivating this dialectical thinking, the ability to build critical arguments based on evidence. We did not allow the students to use any of the evidence that they went out and researched to be anything but primary sources. So we didn't allow, for instance, interest group literature. Instead, we asked that they look at the facts of the case and then decide how to build their arguments. So this is a really excellent approach. Of course, it's one that my partner, Dr. Boyer, uses in the legal profession quite a bit. And historically, legal profession has leaned on debates. And so while the United States has used debates and still uses debates, they kind of got overshadowed by other pedagogies. So we use the debate pedagogy in a virtual exchange that was synchronous, that took place for an hour on these 2 groups being supportive or opposed to nuclear fuel reprocessing. And we found some really, I think, important outcomes for virtual exchange using this type of debate. Students.
Could you share them for our audience?
Oh,
please?
Definitely. Students really, the feedback that we got from students was really extraordinary. First of all, we had we had a 100% response rate in our teaching evaluations, and so we took, we have an IRB, and so we took some of those questions and feedback qualitatively and looked at what was actually going on with using these virtual debates inside of virtual exchange. And the students commented very candidly and were eager to comment. The ratings on the course were very high, which some of the literature in virtual exchange says, it can be difficult to coordinate. It can, sometimes students are not as supportive of using virtual exchange because it does take a bit of extra effort on the student's part as well as on the faculty members' part. But we found quite to the contrary. We had very high ratings, high response rates, and the students said things like how they enjoyed working together in small groups. How for the French students, it improved their language skills. And that was one of the learning outcomes for my French partner's course. The United States students were very happy to meet people from different cultures, different backgrounds, and they were engaged in a project. So this wasn't just perhaps a language or cultural alone learning outcome. They actually were achieving language learning outcomes and cultural learning outcomes while focused on the public policy of nuclear reprocessing. And so that really is the engaging hook that we had in the course. And students reported that the meetings went well, they enjoyed the conversations, they felt that this was a strong cultural exchange because it showed the different cultural aspects that are brought to the public policy of nuclear fuel reprocessing. So we got very, very positive feedback from our students, but I think part of that reason is because the students were focused on a project, on building a debate, and they had to function as a team asynchronously before the debate took place, and then come together during the debate. And I think that really worked in this case.
This is amazing. I think our audience has learned a lot about the virtues of using debates and how important is this as a pedagogy of active learning. And obviously the feedback that you have received shows that the students not only actively participated, but they also had a very an experience, a learning experience that probably they're going to continue learning from this for the rest of their academic and professional life. Because as you mentioned before, there were studies that show this long-term influence on learning and higher achievements for people that had participated in debates. How has this pedagogical tool shaped and influenced your teaching practices? Have you used it in other virtual exchanges, or is something that you are thinking of implementing in the future, or perhaps influencing more people to use it?
Well, we in my repertoire of teaching, I've stuck with debates just on this topic because it's such a polarized topic, particularly right now. We know right now that the international community is somewhat polarized, and debate is really an essential function for a democracy. Having this kind of different polarized sides come together and discuss the issues based on evidence and facts is a great tool for a civil society, which I think we could benefit from right now. These tool is very helpful to take outside of the classroom, and having this experience that the students have can build, so teach them, expose them on how to build this intercultural and social communications with people who have different views. And I believe this experience in the classroom of using debates, you begin to learn about practicing empathy, listening, and learning in a more humane way of how to disagree than what is taking place right now around the world in a variety of different public policies and international conflicts. And so I think this particular tool taught a very useful, practical experience that our students can use outside of the classroom. And keep in mind, I'll say this again, our students were from very different disciplines, very different age groups, very different years in school. And what I did not mention was that the French students had a synchronous course. They had an in-classroom course. My students, and being freshmen, they were all asynchronous. And so my class was a general education class, and the students came together to do the meetings that we talk about, the first meeting and the second meeting, where they talk to the students underneath the global learning format before they do the assignment. And then when they do the assignment, they come together a third time synchronously on Zoom. And so this course and this research is a great demonstration of the hybrid pedagogy, the mixed types of multidisciplinary majors, and as well as the year in school that the particular learner is. And it went off fabulously because the students are very interested in being focused on a public policy like nuclear energy, like nuclear fuel reprocessing, that is contemporary, that is very dynamic. And so the students were highly engaged.
This is amazing, because what you have described is not just the impact that it had on students, but also the actual topic of the debates, but also the methodology employed shows how much it touches a very wide umbrella of the sustainable development goals, not only the environmental, but also the social. And I think this is a value that people from our audience involved in teaching and pedagogy in all areas can actually use. It shows that multidisciplinary classes from different parts of the world can actually show and demonstrate the amount of research they have done, the individual critical thinking, how to build critical arguments. And this, as a social skill, actually builds up, as you said, very importantly, on democracy, which is something of a value, a very important value in a globalized world. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about debates as a wonderful pedagogical tool to employ in our teaching.
And let me say one more thing. This was an interesting partnership in that I had the course. I had the nuclear energy and nuclear waste course that I had been teaching. And about 10 years ago, when I went to globalize it, meaning provide a global learning partner for my students inside of the course, what was interesting is I tried to find a partner from France that I could do this with. And I actually was striking out at trying to get a partner. And so I went to a conference, an international virtual exchange conference, and I went to one of their networking rooms. And when I say went to, I mean virtually went into the room and put up there that I was looking for a virtual exchange partner from France. So I didn't get anyone from that particular interaction, but somebody from the French embassy was in the networking room online, and they got back to me. And so I got my partner in this case by going to the international virtual networking at the conference, posting a request, and then following up with the French embassy to get Dr. Cynthia Boyer to be a partner with me. So I think that's a pretty unique way of finding a partner, but it was very successful in terms of really getting a partner whose students are interested, not just in language learning, which is important, but also in putting together critical thinking arguments on a controversial policy topic.
That is correct. This has been an amazing discussion. I have personally learned so much, and I do hope that our audience has enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you very much, Professor Tzoumis, for this podcast. And we'll see our audience in one of our next podcast. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Douvlou. I really enjoyed this podcast.